Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and there's something about this episode that I need to let you know ahead of time. It's not the normal, everyday 10-minute episode. It wasn't even planned to be an episode initially. It was a blog post I wrote for 10minutemurder.com. That was the intended purpose of it, and that was it. But a lot of people read it, and I thought, well, maybe it would make a decent episode, not to throw in the mix of the normal Tuesday, Thursday cycle, but just throw in there as an extra, because this isn't a timed out situation like my normal ones are. I try to keep those to 10 minutes. This one, at this point, I'm just starting the episode. I have no idea how long it's going to be. It's definitely longer than 10 minutes, so we'll find out together. And that's about the best I can do with the disclaimer. So let's get into it. Ted Bundy was born on November 24th, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. His birth certificate said, "Father unknown," which was true, but everything else about the situation, not so much. He came into the world as Theodore Robert Cowell, and from the start, his life was a lie wrapped in a cover-up tied with a neat little bow of 1940s shame. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22, unmarried, and Catholic, which in 1946 meant she might as well have been excommunicated by the wallpaper. To avoid all that scandal, she gave birth in the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers, one of those institutions designed to quietly fix problems like Ted. And fix it they did. Eleanor's parents brought her and the baby back to their home in Philadelphia, where Ted was raised to believe his grandparents were his parents, and that his mom was actually his sister. Let that settle in for a quick second. The woman changing his diapers, tucking him in, doing all the heavy emotional lifting of parenthood, just his sister. Totally normal. Nothing to see here. In terms of long-term psychological fallout, this kind of foundational identity lie isn't exactly best practice. Some psychologists have pointed out that when you mess with a child's basic understanding of who they are, they risk skewing their sense of reality. Others say Bundy had enough red flags waving around that this one might not have been the deal breaker. But still, this wasn't a great start. Then there's the question of who his father was, a question Eleanor never really answered. She said it was a war veteran, then a sailor, then maybe no one. Bundy himself, later in life, suggested something darker, that he might have been the product of incest, possibly fathered by his own grandfather. Now, there's no evidence to confirm that, but it is one of those theories that refuses to go away. And when you stack it next to the rest of the chaos, it starts to feel a little too plausible. Either way, Ted Bundy's origin story wasn't built on love or stability. It was built on denial and secrets. And that early split between who he was and who he was told to be, that never really went away. When Ted was around 4, his, air quotes, sister finally became his mother, officially. Eleanor packed them both up and left Philadelphia behind, landing in Tacoma, Washington. Completely new coast, new start, same weird family baggage. A couple of years later, she married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a quiet, working-class guy who adopted Ted and gave him that last name that we all know. But calling him father figure? That's being generous. Ted reportedly never liked him. In fact, he barely tolerated him. According to people who knew the family, Ted looked down on Johnny, saw him as dull, uneducated, and beneath him. Which is wild coming from a teenage boy who was, at the time, shoplifting and failing gym class. Still, Johnny tried. He worked as a cook, supported the family, and eventually had 4 more kids by Eleanor. By all accounts, he did his best to include Ted, taking him on camping trips, tossing a football, doing regular dad stuff. Ted wanted no part of it. He thought the whole thing was beneath him. He didn't want blue-collar weekends or sibling bonding time. He wanted something else, something bigger. At this point, I think it's worth asking, what exactly did Ted think he deserved? Because even back then, long before anyone knew his name, he had this intense need to be seen as exceptional, special, destined for more. And if reality didn't agree with him, he just rewrote reality. That would become a running theme here. He told different stories to different people about where he came from. In one version, he had a wealthy, important father. In another, he was descendant from royalty. At one point, he even claimed his family had a chauffeur. They didn't. It was like he was allergic to his own origin story, or he kept trying to outgrow it by lying his way into a better one. But underneath the lies was a kid who never really attached to anyone. Not his stepfather, not his mom, not even his own siblings. People who knew him growing up said he always seemed a little off, polite and quiet, but cold, distant, calculating, like he was watching people instead of connecting with them. So while the Bundys were trying to play house, Ted was already working on becoming someone else entirely. By the time Ted Bundy hit high school, he'd figured something out. He wasn't naturally charismatic. He wasn't popular. He wasn't even particularly likable, but he could fake it. So he did. He studied the people who had what he wanted, confidence, charm, social power, and started mimicking them. Bundy didn't develop a personality so much as assemble one. Think Frankenstein, but with better hair and a copy of How to Win Friends and Influence People tucked under one arm. At school, he was mostly a loner. Teachers said he was intelligent, but unmotivated. Other students described him as awkward, socially clueless, emotionally flat, and kind of a tryhard. He didn't date, he didn't make friends easily, but every once in a while he'd turn on the charm and surprise people. That switch he learned to flip later in life, it started right here. Outside of school, things got weirder. Bundy developed a fascination with crime, specifically true crime, but not in the podcast and wine sense. He was obsessed with stories of violence, especially sexual violence. He read detective novels constantly. Some accounts say he dug through trash cans to find pictures of naked women. He started peeping into windows. Voyeurism was a pastime. And, of course, he lied. Constantly. About everything. Even small stuff that didn't even matter. Now, not every kid who's awkward and likes creepy books grows up to be a killer. But with Bundy, there's this thread running through it all. Control. He wanted to control how people saw him. Control what they knew about him. Control how close they could get. And all that control masked something important. He didn't actually feel much. No empathy, no guilt, no shame. Just strategy. When people talk about Bundy as two-faced, this is where that started. He wasn't a monster with a mask. He was the mask. The persona came first. The rest just followed. In 1969, Ted Bundy met a woman who would unknowingly become the dress rehearsal for his entire persona. Elizabeth Klepfer. She was a single mom working as a secretary at the University of Washington. By her own account, she was shy, a little lonely, and maybe looking for something steady. Bundy, clean-cut, well-dressed, polite, seemed like the kind of guy who had it all together. The kind of guy you would bring home to meet your parents. The kind of guy who helps your kid with their homework and makes breakfast on Sundays. So when he asked her out, she said yes. And for a while, things seemed normal. Bundy helped raise her daughter. He made dinner, he studied psychology at UW, and talked about going to law school. He even volunteered at a suicide crisis hotline, because, yes, life is just that ironic. But behind the scenes, Ted was still Ted. He was also dating other women, stealing, lying, and laying the groundwork for a much darker future. Their relationship wasn't about love, it was about rehearsal. Bundy was learning how to be two people at once. He tested how far he could stretch the truth without breaking it. He learned to lie directly to someone's face while still showing up with flowers the next day. He figured out how to seem emotionally available while also feeling nothing inside. And Elizabeth, for a long time, bought it because there was nothing obvious to warn her otherwise. Except there kind of was. She'd catch him sneaking around, find things in his apartment that didn't make sense. Once, she even found a bowl filled with house keys that didn't belong to either of them. But every time she confronted him, he had an explanation on deck and ready to go. It didn't even need to be good, just confident. Years later, she would turn him in, twice. But at this point, she was still in it, deeply. And Bundy was thriving under the cover of domesticity. From the outside, he looked like a guy getting his life together. On the inside, he was taking notes. Because if there's one thing Bundy mastered in his early years, it wasn't violence or manipulation. It was the appearance of normal. And Elizabeth was his first real test subject. One of the most frustrating things about trying to understand Ted Bundy is that he lied constantly, not just to his victims, not just to the cops, but to literally anyone, including himself, especially when it came to his past. As he got older, Bundy started playing fast and loose with his own origin story. In interviews, he'd offer up conflicting versions of his childhood, like he was choosing from a menu. Sometimes he said he had a happy, stable home. Other times it was abusive. One week, he was raised in a strict religious household. The next, he claimed to be neglected and unwanted. And every time someone tried to pin him down, he changed the subject or changed the story. It wasn't just deflection, it was his strategy. Bundy knew people were obsessed with motive. They wanted a reason, a backstory, a trauma to hang the horror on. And he used that to manipulate the narrative. If he was talking to a psychiatrist, he leaned into the mental health angle. If it was a journalist, he'd toss a little family drama in the mix. Talking to a religious counselor, suddenly it was pornography that corrupted him. He gave everyone just enough to chase a theory. What's wild is how he weaponized the idea of being misunderstood. He liked the myth. He fed it. He built a whole persona around the idea that he was just some tragic figure. Brilliant, sensitive, wronged by the world. The fact that people were still debating his childhood while he was confessing to murder was not a coincidence. It was part of his performance. He even did this with his name. He knew Ted Bundy carried weight. So when he talked about the little boy who was born as Theodore Cowell, the kid raised in a fake family, the one who may or may not have known who his father was, he talked about that kid like he was someone else entirely. A shadow, a ghost, someone he left behind. But the truth, that kid never left. He just got better at hiding. By the early 1970s, Ted Bundy had everyone fooled. He was a law student, a boyfriend, a volunteer, the kind of guy who helped you carry your groceries and open doors for strangers. He knew exactly what people expected from a good man, and he gave it to them with a smile. But the cracks were already showing. Friends described him as a little too controlling, a little too interested in how people reacted to fear. He didn't just tell lies, he lived them. He started stealing more, cheating in school, skipping classes. He'd tell Elizabeth he was going to the library, then disappear for hours, sometimes days. He began collecting things that didn't make sense. Stolen IDs, women's clothing, handcuffs, a crowbar. He wasn't just preparing for something, he was rehearsing, testing boundaries, seeing what he could get away with before anyone noticed. Nobody did. And here's the uncomfortable part. People didn't notice because they didn't want to. Bundy didn't look like a threat. He didn't feel dangerous. He was clean-cut and educated. He didn't raise his voice. He wasn't scary. He didn't match the monster people imagined in their heads. Even when Elizabeth went to the police, twice, with suspicions about his behavior, they brushed it off. He just didn't seem like the type, as if there was a type. And that's what made him so dangerous. Bundy didn't hide in the shadows. He hid in plain sight. And in these early years, long before the crimes that made him infamous, he was already learning how easy it was to disappear into people's expectations. All he had to do was look the part. By the time Ted Bundy entered law school in 1973, The mask wasn't just something he wore, it was who he had become. There was no clear line between real and pretend anymore. He had shaped himself into whatever the moment required. Need to impress a professor? He was articulate, curious, and respectful. Need to charm a woman at a party? He was attentive and confident. Need to manipulate someone into trusting him? He was soft-spoken and helpful, maybe even a little vulnerable, just enough to lower your guard. The truth underneath all that was cold. Bundy wasn't building a future, he was building a trap. His relationships were shallow. His resume was padded. His law school record was already slipping, but he kept up the illusion that he was headed somewhere big. His girlfriend believed in him. His classmates liked him. Even some local political figures thought he had potential. That word came up a lot back then, potential. But behind the scenes, Bundy was restless, bored. The lies weren't enough anymore. The pretending didn't satisfy him like it used to. He had created this perfect mask, and now he needed something to feed it, something that would let him control not just his image, but other people's lives, their fear, their safety, their endings. That's where the early life of Ted Bundy ends. Not in blood, not yet, but in that strange, quiet moment right before the storm, when he was still just a man with no record, no body count, and no one looking twice. What came next wasn't sudden. It was earned carefully over years of practice, years of pretending, years of learning how to blend in. The monster didn't break out. He walked through the front door. Thanks for listening to this episode of 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. And again, this isn't a normal episode. If this is your first time listening, don't expect this every single week. This is in addition to the podcast. In case you missed it at the beginning, this was a blog that I wrote for 10minutemurder.com, and it got a lot of views, so I thought I would turn it into something you can listen to, because not everyone goes to 10minutemurder.com and reads the stuff I put there. And that's cool. You don't have to do that. But I thought that was getting enough attention. The early life of Ted Bundy before the murders. I just wanted to put it here and let the rest of you read it with your ears. So that's what this was. Again, thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder. See you next time.